Alright, let's get real about medieval medicine, because the popular image of it is basically a comedy of errors wrapped in superstition. You know the drill. Leeches galore, weird potions bubbling away, and doctors waving their hands like they're casting spells instead of trying to fix you. But here's the kicker. Medieval medicine wasn't just a blind stumble through nonsense. Yeah, they had mystics and miracle cures, but they also had some surprising smarts tucked in there, mixing old-school guesswork with bits of actual observation. It wasn't all smoke and mirrors, even if it mostly looks that way in retrospect. First off, forget the idea that medieval doctors were just clueless charlatans. They were working within a framework that combined what they could see and feel with centuries-old texts and a big dose of religious belief. The spiritual side was huge. Illness was often seen as punishment from God or the result of evil spirits messing with your insides. That meant treatments had a foot in the mystical world, since healing wasn't just about fixing the body, but also about restoring your soul's balance. So yeah, medieval doctors basically guessed your illness by how weirdly your urine looked, but they also prayed, read from holy texts, and performed rituals. It's like mixing a science lab with a church service and hoping for the best. This blend of the empirical and the mystical shaped everything they did. They inherited medical knowledge from the ancient Greeks and Romans. Hippocrates and Galen were the rock stars of the medical world, their ideas treated like gospel. These guys believed that the body was governed by four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and that illness came from imbalances in these fluids. So when you're lying there feeling awful, the doctor wasn't just poking around. They were trying to restore your body's internal harmony. Of course, the way they went about it was often a bit brutal: bloodletting to drain excess blood or purging to get rid of the bad stuff. Not exactly a spa day, but hey, it was the closest thing to a cure most folks had back then. Religion wasn't just a backdrop, it was a main act. The church played a massive role in healthcare, running hospitals that were more like places to pray and care for the sick rather than centers for cutting-edge science. Monks and nuns tended to the ill, mixing herbal remedies with spiritual comfort. The idea was that healing the soul was as important, if not more so, than healing the body. So, your recovery wasn't just about surviving the infection or injury, but also proving your faith and moral standing. Medieval doctors basically guessed your illness by how weirdly your urine looked, but they also prayed a lot. And sometimes, that was the only medicine you got. Medical knowledge was passed down through universities, and written texts copied by hand in dusty monasteries. This wasn't a free-for-all. It was tightly controlled and heavily influenced by the church's teachings. You couldn't just say whatever you wanted about the body or illness without risking being branded a heretic. So, medical practice was a balancing act between empirical observation, ancient authority, and religious doctrine. This meant progress was slow, but it wasn't totally frozen in time. Some doctors started to get curious and performed dissections to better understand anatomy, even if the church frowned upon cutting open bodies. This gradual acceptance of anatomy laid groundwork for later breakthroughs, even if medieval doctors mostly stuck to the humor's theory. Now, don't imagine a shiny hospital with nurses buzzing around. Hospitals were more like hospices or shelters where people went to die or be cared for if they had nowhere else to turn. The medical staff were a mix of trained physicians, barber surgeons, and herbalists. Physicians were the educated elite, often university-trained, but their treatments could be pretty hands-off. They diagnosed and prescribed but didn't often perform surgery. Barber surgeons were the ones with the razors, doing everything from cutting hair to setting broken bones and bloodletting. They were a bit like the jack-of-all-trades in healthcare, skilled but not quite doctors. And then there were the apothecaries, mixing herbs and potions, sometimes more art than science. This setup meant that people's experiences with healthcare varied wildly depending on where they lived and who they could afford or knew. If you were rich, you might get a physician's visit, with all the complicated charts and urine inspections. Yes, medieval doctors basically guessed your illness by how weirdly your urine looked. Poor folks relied more on local healers, herbal remedies, and prayer. The whole system was patchy, and the line between medicine, magic, and religion was often blurry. You could have a doctor prescribing a bleeding session, while a priest sprinkled holy water in the same room. Despite all the weirdness, medieval medicine laid the groundwork for future advances. They kept alive the study of anatomy, even if it was limited, and their hospitals were early versions of what we now call healthcare institutions. The emphasis on observation, even if filtered through humoral theory, was a step away from pure superstition. The very fact that doctors went to university and studied texts meant there was a structure for passing knowledge down, which is more than you can say for earlier times. So, the next time you think medieval medicine was just a joke, remember, it was a messy, strange, and often ineffective system, but it was also a foundation for what came after. Getting a bloodletting wasn't exactly a spa day, that's for sure. But it was done with a purpose, even if that purpose was based on wrong assumptions. The smell of herbs, the sight of boiling potions, the clinking of surgical tools, it was all part of a world trying to make sense of sickness without germs or microscopes. Your world shrank to the few herbs and potions around you, and the doctor's advice might be part science, part superstition, and a whole lot of hope. Medieval breath mints weren't a thing, so you probably got a mouthful of garlic or something equally pungent if you were lucky. So, you get this strange dance between knowledge and mystery, science and faith. The medieval doctor might look at you, check the color and smell of your urine, ask about your lifestyle, and then prescribe a mix of bloodletting, herbal teas, and prayers. It sounds rough, but it was the best they had. Hospitals were often places to die rather than heal, but monks and nuns did their best with what they had. And behind the scenes, scholars were copying ancient texts, debating theories, and slowly pushing the boundaries of what was known. In the end, medieval medicine was a patchwork quilt, some pieces practical, others purely mystical. It's easy to mock with hindsight, but those doctors were working in a world without microscopes, vaccines, or antibiotics. They had to rely on observation, ancient wisdom, and faith. So yes, medieval doctors basically guessed your illness by how weirdly your urine looked, but they also laid the bricks for modern medicine, even if they did it while wearing robes and mumbling prayers. Getting a bloodletting wasn't exactly a spa day, but it was part of a system that kept people alive long enough for better ideas to take root. So, you think medieval medicine was just a bunch of clueless fumbling? Well, buckle up, because the treatments people actually went through were as wild and weird as you might expect, but with some surprising doses of method behind the madness. Sure, they didn't have germ theory or antibiotics, but they did have bloodletting, herbal remedies, and surgeries that could make you cringe, or if you're lucky, actually help. Getting a bloodletting wasn't exactly a spa day, but it was the closest thing to a cure most folks had back then. Bloodletting was the superstar treatment. If you were sick, chances are the doctor wanted to drain some of your blood to rebalance your humors. They believed that too much blood or the wrong kind of bad blood caused all sorts of problems. So, out came a lancet or a leech, and off went a few ounces of your lifeblood. It sounds brutal, and it was, but it was done with a sincere hope of restoring your body's harmony. And let's be real, it probably made some people feel better just because it was something being done, something active happening to fight the illness. Medieval doctors basically guessed your illness by how weirdly your urine looked, but the rituals, like bloodletting, gave patients a sense that the doctor was on the case. Herbal remedies were another pillar of medieval medicine. Your world shrank to the few herbs and potions around you, plucked from gardens or gathered in the wild. People used everything from rosemary and sage to more exotic plants, all believed to have healing powers. Some herbs actually had real effects, like willow bark, which contains compounds similar to aspirin, but most were hit or miss. These remedies came in the form of teas, poultices, salves, and powders. Imagine a pungent, bitter brew that you had to choke down, or a sticky paste slapped onto a wound with no guarantee it would help. Medieval breath mints weren't a thing, so herbal medicine often doubled as a way to mask awful smells in the sick room. Surgery in the Middle Ages? Yeah, it happened, and sometimes it wasn't a total disaster. Surgical tools were surprisingly advanced for the time. Forceps, scalpels, and bone saws made their appearances, carved by skilled hands. Surgeons, often barber surgeons, performed everything from setting broken bones to removing tumors and draining abscesses. Of course, without anesthesia or antiseptics, surgery was a terrifying ordeal. Imagine being cut open with a saw or knife while the doctor tried to work quickly before you passed out from pain, or infection did its dirty work later. Still, these tools and techniques showed a level of practical knowledge that often gets overlooked. They were developing skills that would eventually evolve into modern surgery, even if the patients mostly hoped for the best. Anatomy was a tricky subject back then. Dissection of human bodies was frowned upon, often banned or restricted by the church, which made learning about the inside of the body a challenge. But curiosity won out, slowly. Some universities and doctors started to perform dissections on cadavers, peeling back layers to better understand muscles, organs, and bones. This was a game changer for medical knowledge, even if it was a slow process. Before that, much of anatomy was guesswork based on animal dissection or ancient texts. So, medieval doctors basically guessed your illness by how weirdly your urine looked, but their growing interest in the body's structure planted seeds for real science. Hygiene, surprisingly, had a place in medieval medical practice, especially in monasteries and early hospitals. Monks and nuns were often the caretakers, and they understood that keeping things clean helped prevent disease spread, at least to some degree. Washing hands, cleaning wounds, and isolating the sick were common in these religious institutions, even if the underlying reasons weren't fully scientific. Their approach was a mix of practical care and spiritual cleanliness, believing that a pure body helped the soul heal. In a world where diseases often ravage populations, any attempt to keep things tidy was a small victory. Still, medieval breath mints weren't a thing, so the sickroom probably smelled like a blend of herbs, sweat, and something you really don't want to identify. But let's not sugarcoat it. Medieval medicine had massive blind spots. Infection and disease transmission were mysteries wrapped in superstition. No one knew about bacteria or viruses, so pus and fever were often misinterpreted as curses or signs of spiritual imbalance. This meant treatment sometimes made things worse, like cutting open wounds without sterilizing tools or using unclean bandages. Getting a bloodletting wasn't exactly a spa day, and sometimes it weakened patients instead of helping. The lack of understanding about infections meant that even the best intentions could turn deadly. Surgery, for all its surprises, was a high-risk gamble. Without anesthesia, patients had to endure the pain screaming, struggling to stay still while the barber surgeon went to work. The tools, though advanced, were often reused without proper cleaning, turning surgeries into potential death sentences. But it was also a time of innovation. Some surgeons developed clever techniques to stop bleeding, like tying off arteries, and others experimented with early forms of prosthetics. They might not have understood germs, but they noticed what worked and what didn't, slowly building a practical knowledge base beneath all the superstition. Herbal remedies, while hit or miss, sometimes had scientific merit. Willow bark's pain-relieving properties are a prime example, but many plants were chosen for their symbolic or spiritual significance rather than real effectiveness. The doctrine of signatures was a popular idea. Plants resembling body parts were thought to heal those parts. So a walnut, looking like a brain, was used to treat headaches. It's a quirky system, sure, but it shows how medieval medicine mixed observation with imagination. Your world shrank to the few herbs and potions around you, and each had a story as much as a purpose. Hospitals and care centers were places where these treatments came together, often under the watchful eyes of monks and nuns. These places were less about curing and more about tending to the sick, providing food, shelter, and spiritual comfort. Still, the integration of hygiene practices and herbal remedies meant patients sometimes got better care than you'd expect. The idea of isolating contagious patients was in its infancy, but it existed. So, while medieval doctors basically guessed your illness by how weirdly your urine looked, the system around them was evolving to offer a rough but real form of medical support. What's fascinating is how all these pieces, bloodletting, herbal medicine, surgery, hygiene, weren't just random acts but part of a larger worldview trying to make sense of sickness. They were trying to rebalance the body, expel evil, and restore harmony, using whatever tools and knowledge they had. It was a messy mix of science, tradition, and faith, often clashing but sometimes working in surprisingly effective ways. So yeah, getting a bloodletting wasn't exactly a spa day, but it was a ritual with purpose. Herbal remedies might taste awful and have unpredictable effects, but some actually eased pain or healed wounds. Surgery was brutal, but it was an early step toward real medical practice. Hygiene was patchy but present, especially in religious communities that cared for the sick. And all the while, doctors and caregivers were learning, experimenting, and slowly pushing the boundaries of what medicine could be. Medieval medicine wasn't perfect by any stretch. It was a world without microscopes, vaccines, or antibiotics, where science, superstition, and faith tangled together in a complicated dance. But it wasn't just a joke or a disaster. It was a crucial stage in the long, slow journey toward modern healthcare, filled with hard lessons and surprising progress. Getting a bloodletting wasn't exactly a spa day, but it was part of a system that kept people alive long enough for better ideas to take root. By the time you reach the tail end of medieval medicine, you start to see how all that messy, muddled practice actually shaped what came next. It's tempting to toss the whole era in the hopelessly ignorant bin, but that would be selling it short. Medieval medicine wasn't just a dark, stagnant pit of superstition. It laid the groundwork for the Renaissance and modern healthcare, even if it took a while for the real breakthroughs to kick in. So, while medieval doctors basically guessed your illness by how weirdly your urine looked, their efforts planted seeds that eventually blossomed into science and reason. One of the biggest legacies was the preservation and transmission of medical knowledge. Monks, scribes, and scholars painstakingly copied ancient texts by hand, keeping alive the works of Hippocrates, Galen, and other early medical thinkers. These texts weren't just dusty relics. They formed the backbone of medical education for centuries. Universities began to pop up, becoming hubs for learning and debate. Sure, they were often stuck in the humoral theory rut, but the very act of institutionalizing medical knowledge meant ideas could be challenged, refined, and improved over time. It's like medieval medicine was a relay race, passing the baton to the Renaissance thinkers, who would finally sprint ahead. The psychological impact of illness and healing rituals during the medieval period is another fascinating piece of the puzzle. Being sick wasn't just a physical ordeal, it was a mental and spiritual roller coaster. Your world shrank to the few herbs and potions around you, and your fate felt tied to both your body and your soul. Healing rituals, prayers, and the presence of clergy weren't just add-ons. They were central to the experience. The mind-body connection was recognized, even if the explanations were different from today's science. So when a priest sprinkled holy water or a doctor performed bloodletting, It was as much about calming fears and restoring hope as it was about physical healing. That psychological boost mattered. Sometimes it was the difference between giving up and fighting on. This interplay between mind and body influenced how society as a whole viewed disease. Illness was often a communal event, with the sick cared for by families, neighbors, and religious communities. The rituals around illness and recovery helped maintain social cohesion, reinforcing faith and shared values. At the same time, fear of contagion led to early forms of quarantine and isolation, attempts to control outbreaks even without understanding what caused them. These social responses laid the foundation for public health practices that would evolve into what we recognize today. Doctor-patient relationships also began to take shape during this time. The medieval physician was often a highly educated figure, but their role was more advisory than hands-on. They diagnosed, prescribed, and sometimes referred patients to barber surgeons for procedures. This division of labor introduced a professional hierarchy in healthcare, distinguishing between theory and practice. Over time, this helped formalize the medical profession, setting standards and expectations that would grow into modern medical ethics and patient care. It wasn't perfect, doctors could be distant, treatments were hit or miss, but it was a start toward a system where the patient's well-being was the focus. The rise of universities was a game changer. Medical faculties emerged, teaching students not just to memorize ancient texts but to observe, question, and debate. This academic environment encouraged a slow but steady shift away from blind faith and authority toward empirical investigation. Dissections became more common, challenging long-held anatomical errors. The printing press, arriving at the tail end of the medieval period, turbocharged the spread of medical knowledge. Suddenly, ideas that were once confined to monasteries and universities could reach a broader audience, accelerating progress. It's easy to forget that many of the enduring myths about medieval medicine come from later romanticized or demonized versions of the past. The truth is messier and more interesting. Medieval doctors weren't just witch doctors waving wands. They were scholars and practitioners doing their best with limited tools and knowledge. Their mistakes and misconceptions were real, but so were their contributions. They kept alive the quest to understand the human body and disease, setting the stage for the scientific revolutions to come. This legacy is a reminder that progress isn't a straight line. It's a zigzag through trial and error, belief and skepticism, failure and discovery. Medieval medicine was a crucial chapter in that story. It shaped how people thought about health, illness, and the body for centuries. It introduced concepts of care, observation, and professional practice that evolved into our modern medical system. So next time you hear someone dismiss medieval medicine as just leeches and superstition, remember the bigger picture. Yes, medieval doctors basically guessed your illness by how weirdly your urine looked, and getting a bloodletting wasn't exactly a spa day. But they also laid down the building blocks for hospitals, medical education, and a more scientific approach to healing. Their world was one where faith, hope, and observation intertwined, creating a complex tapestry that carried the human struggle with disease forward into new eras. In the end, the legacy of medieval medicine is a mixed bag, part myth, part miracle, and all human. It reminds us that medicine is as much about culture and belief as it is about science. And it shows that even in the darkest times, people were searching for answers, trying to heal themselves and their communities. That relentless quest is something we still carry with us today.